Hello and welcome. In this video what we're going to be looking at interpreting and starting to break down The Great Gatsby and its many complex themes and ideas which make it a little bit difficult to write about because there are so many and there are so many different ideas in there. So what we're going to look at in this video is we're going to look at some of the key themes of the text and go through just exploring a few of them and giving you a starting point for which you can then launch into your own analysis and your own discussion. But looking at these ideas first and sort of looking at maybe some examples of where they fit in and where they're going to fit in with your potential response. Because of course Gatsby could ask you to write about any number of things. So to have all these ideas as sort of something in your frame of mind gives you something to write about no matter what question's thrown at you. Now, it is almost like studying a primary record of the 1920s. It was written in the 20s. It was written by an author whose life has sort of parables or connections with the sorts of things that happen in the story. Indeed, a lot of the characters, if you were to believe his biography, were actually based on people in his life. And certainly the narrator of Nick is somewhat based quite loosely on himself. And even his lover in the story, Jordan, is representative of another woman he was dating at the time. So there are a number of basically connections to his life. So it sort of it is a case of art imitating life a little bit. And certainly it is something that does really represent the period quite profoundly in the sense that it speaks its language. It follows its way of thinking, and it's almost like it follows the customs and traditions of the 1920s. And it's certainly one of the things that happens because of the fact that it is written in the era, that it does speak like a text which is written from that age. Now let's have a look at themes, and particularly wealth is probably the most dominant theme in there, and materialism as well, which you can also, and materialism is more of a cynical representation of wealth. So they're both pretty much the same idea, they just basically phrased a little bit differently. And they are given basically a nihilistic or really self-destructive kind of quality. And certainly the power of money and the power of wealth in this case is why it does buy a lot. One thing it doesn't buy is happiness, but according to the old mantra at least it doesn't, but certainly in the case of this text it doesn't. And it also basically destroys a lot of lives, and particularly the fact that there's this wealth and this power, this sense of boredom. Although one wouldn't really call it that, because all the characters are indeed quite busy people. It's just more a case of they've got so much money that, as I said, they don't really know what to do with it at times. And so this self-destructive quality sort of creeps in there. This wealth and status, particularly in Gatsby, is a destructive factor. It leads to his death. This almost buying what he wants. This the fact that his wealth allows him to connect with Daisy is something that is quite destructive, and certainly it does eventually kill him, literally. It's a destructive force as the decadent waves give a sense of freedom which they can't really manage in any sort of beneficial way. And certainly these lavish parties and all these different things which are prevalent in the text are sort of almost meaningless. They're not achieving any sort of purpose, in which case you might ask yourself, and certainly from a modern reading of it you would go, well, most parties don't really serve a purpose. They're to go out there and have fun, and certainly I wouldn't disagree with that idea, but the way it is looked at in this text is basically that these gatherings, these lavish get-togethers are not really set in the traditions that they are in the past. And certainly when you look at it in a meaningful sort of way, or if you're looking at it in a way that I guess is considered meaningful, you would see that its morality is pointing towards this cynicism of this culture, this fact that these people who are young and in love and getting drunk on weekends after work, all these sorts of things, are basically have nothing else in their lives, and certainly represents a sort of shallowness that this wealth has. Buchanan's life as well, for instance, is one ruled by the fact that they have everything, and even their daughter is corrupted by this. She's someone who wants everything, and this wealth and decadence is basically almost crippled the household. It's meant that everyone is demanding things off each other, and it's sort of it's this very toxic environment, and it's blamed on wealth. It could be, of course, due to other factors, but in the text and the way it's portrayed, it's considered that wealth is the center of this argument. Society and status is another thing, and this is also quite connected to the idea of wealth. And it is the upper class who have attained the American dream, sort of undermined by their own desire to keep showing that they have it. So in other words, these are people with wealth, and they love to show it off. They love to show off how wealthy they are. And they love to show how they've reached the American dream of prosperity and fame and all these sorts of things, and they're in the right sort of social circles. And the fact that they have to keep proving that to other people is something that actually does make them quite vulnerable. And certainly in the case of Gatsby, this idea of keeping up appearances is ultimately a hollow feat. Only 3 people came to his funeral, so that shows how much this actually really did mean in the long run, and that by the time he did die, and he died young, he had nothing in his life. He had no close friends, nothing that he could consider tangible as something he could really leave behind as a legacy. And so this keeping up appearances thing is one that does come out quite a bit. It also enables them to exploit their status in order to basically stretch this idea of law and decency. These are, particularly in the case of Gatsby, I mean, he's got connections to a known criminal, and in the sense of decency, these are families which engage in affairs quite frequently and don't really think much of it. And certainly in the case of Tom and his lover, he almost doesn't think that it's a problem. It's only a problem when Myrtle starts mentioning Daisy's name that he starts to really get offended by it, and it's almost a case of that they live separate lives and that they should be just happy to be with him. So there is a little bit of decency that is basically undermined by the fact that he has this status and he has this power and wealth, and particularly in the case of the law as well, is that they feel like because they have power and wealth that they can circumvent certain aspects of the law as well, that they don't have to live like good, honest, hard-working citizens, that they are almost selected as being part of a higher purpose and higher being and all that sort of jazz, really. It's something where wealth is basically giving people a whole heap of things which they haven't necessarily earned. And it basically then also leads to this idea of boredom and discontent, the lack of trust for others. And as I said before, it's represented by Gatsby's funeral, which only 3 people do attend it. And particularly this lack of trust for others is a sense of that no one can really trust each other because of the fact that they're almost constantly undermining each other. That they're constantly sort of having to show things that they're not and trying to prove that they are wealthier almost sometimes than they actually are. And the pursuit of happiness then also comes out of this. And Gatsby's pursuit of happiness particularly is this driving force of the text. And certainly his purpose for being where he is driven by his desire to be with the woman he always loved. Now, of course, the story behind Gatsby and Daisy was that they met when he was a stationed officer and was about to go off to war, and they did meet then. And then when he came back, being disillusioned as so many other World War I veterans were, he basically got fed up with a lot of things. Did turn towards organised crime, it is alleged. It never really gets explicitly stated, but we can assume from the connections with the characters that he does have these connections with organised crime. And in doing so, in having this sort of opulence and wealth, he is able to then pursue his dreams, and that is to be with Daisy. The characters all leave the West to pursue this happiness, to pursue not only this wealth, but to pursue this culture and life which they think will make them happy. That fulfills their hopes and dreams, and almost this little boy and little girl desire to, one day I'm going to live in the biggest house with the fanciest clothes and the best cars and all the rest. And this is sort of something that manifests itself into what we see, and then once they have it, they almost don't want it anymore. They almost think that, well, it's great having it and all, but I'm used to it. I want more, and I want more, and I want more. So there's never really a sense of satisfaction, and certainly this is where pursuit of happiness sort of takes a new direction. It takes a different step and almost leads to a downward spiral because they can't get any more than what they have. Gatsby's pursuit of Daisy is almost bordering on an obsession, and certainly highlights the lengths one's wealth will go to pursue someone's desire, and particularly the futility of such an exercise is also represented. That, as I said, money does not really buy happiness in this case, and certainly it buys him a brief moment of happiness, but it doesn't bring him his happy ever after he's looking for, and certainly that's one of the things that does come out through the text. Ignorance is also quite a key idea in this text, and particularly this brand of society which neglects politics and others. This isn't really the kind of wealthy community that engages a lot in philanthropy and charity and those sorts of things. They are pretty much self-obsessed, and this is sort of an age as well where the poor were considered to be parasites. They weren't considered to be people. So for the wealthy to give to the poor was not really something that was romanticized all that much, and especially it was one of those things that while certain people did feel some sort of guilt, and certainly some were charitable, that's not to paint them all the same brush, there were many who didn't feel that their wealth needed to be distributed amongst others, that they could keep it all for themselves. And certainly this ignorance of this culture, as I mentioned before, particularly in this social circle, these are war veterans. These are people, particularly in the case of Carraway and Gatsby, these are people who don't really have time for politics anymore because of what politics made them do. It made them go to war. It made them do a whole heap of things which they're busy trying to forget. And so this decadent culture is a way of almost getting away from all that. And certainly the fact that they have a lot of money, they don't have to worry about where their next dollar is going to come from, means that they don't necessarily need to worry about what politicians are doing, and certainly not what happens in cultures outside of their own. It is represented by the nature of the characters, and particularly those who live estranged from their own community. They're cut off from the outside world, and certainly, as I said, this is a culture which is moves away from its basically its environment. West Egg is literally a community to itself. It's almost gated. There's if you don't live or you don't know someone who lives there, you're pretty much shut out. And that's one of the things about this idea of ignorance, is it's one of those things that the exclusivity of this society means that they are almost neglectful of other people, and certainly it carries a sense of that with wealth does not come responsibility, and it's certainly one of the ideas that comes across quite strongly, and certainly comes across in a way which one who looks at the text quite cynically, or looks at it with a cynical sort of mind at least, can look and go, okay, these aren't necessarily good people, and certainly you don't have a connection that any of these people are good. All right, and it is this opulent community that Fitzgerald through Carraway is almost carrying this cynicism, and certainly shows this idea, and also the irony that despite their higher education, many characters refuse to pay attention to the world around them. These are all college-educated people. To get into this sort of social circle, you have to be college-educated. You have to have gone to one of the prestigious universities, and yet they don't know much about anything outside their own little world, which sort of shows the price of what this higher education actually really gives them. It doesn't really give them a lot. So it just gives them a specialist tool that they can use, but the rest is pretty much useless and meaningless. And there's no education about the needs of others and those sorts of things as well. Okay, now the idea of integrity also does come up with this idea of ignorance, at least, in that it's something that's constantly questioned throughout the story, but also it sort of links into this idea that through, I guess, this ignorance of others, they also have set themselves up as being characters who are not really trustworthy, and certainly the integrity of those who have this power and wealth and glory, and I guess in a sense, constantly questioned by their almost lack of morals at times. Gatsby's, for instance, connection with Wolsheim, who is a New York gangster, indicates wealth is generated probably from criminal activity, and certainly highlights this lack of integrity within his own character. Now, the character is basically a play on of Arnold Rothstein, who was an infamous character at the time, and sort of indicates this very shady connection, and certainly Rothstein in real life, the real life version of Wilshire, was a bootlegger, and it's sort of indicating the same thing as well. So people who knew about the era and certainly knew about the time would sort of pick up immediately that this character is almost is pretty much a bootlegger, and this connection with him, this link between Gatsby and him, and certainly the fact that Nick and Gatsby meet him, is a sense to show that the integrity of Gatsby, even though in many cases his methods and certainly he seems an honest and nice sort of character. He's genuinely well-rounded, but yet he has this sort of strange side, this criminal side even, which doesn't really get talked about and doesn't really get mentioned a great deal. It's sort of one of those sort of dirty little secrets that he has, but he just doesn't really bring to the fore. And certainly the character of Tom is one who also seems, in fact all characters do, lack a sense of integrity, but the fact his is quite different. He is a brutish sort of character. He dominates people, he dominates women, and he doesn't treat women with any sort of respect at all. Or he does with some, but not really with a lot. And this is questioned by his affair and also by his self-centeredness as well. He allows Gatsby to take his fall for the bad things that he did, and even the things that his wife did. And this self-centeredness, this egocentricity of him, indicates this sort of material wealth where to have all these things means you don't have to care about other people. No one else has to do anything for you, and or you don't have to do anything for them, for that matter. And certainly in his case, he sort of shows this in his nature and the way that he acts around people. And Carraway is almost the figure of purity. He doesn't really he indicates that yes, he was caught up in this sort of atmosphere, but he doesn't really perpetrate it in any great deal. He's almost revolted by the lack of integrity, and it drives him eventually to leave New York at the conclusion, or leave West Egg, should I say, at the conclusion of the text. And certainly we see that, and certainly this sort of, you could, from looking at the context of the story, have a similar view of Fitzgerald as well. But definitely in the case of Carraway, he's one of those people who doesn't mind indulging in a bit of it, but once he really has a taste of what it is he's indulging in, he doesn't really want it anymore. He doesn't really want this wealth and popularity and all the rest of these sorts of things. He doesn't want to be in this culture anymore, and it's because of basically the fact that they're so toxic. And it is, as I said before, representative of the 1920s, and certainly it reveals a number of insights about the culture and the people of the time. And certainly it reveals a lot about the World War I veterans, for instance, and they're both disenchanted. And certainly there are a lot of people at the time who had, certainly a lot of men who had returned from World War I and didn't really feel like they got the recognition for it. And while they did get treated relatively well, they were often ignored. And certainly the fact that a lot of them underwent some really horrible experiences, particularly trench warfare was one of the most horrible things that a human can go through. This was something that was lost upon others who hadn't experienced it. And certainly there was this sensation from those looking outside that going off to war was this romantic thing, that everyone who was fighting was doing it for the good and honor of the nation, whereas those who'd come back didn't quite think that way. And certainly it almost fueled the mentality of everyone for themselves, because it sort of made them feel that they couldn't trust anyone in the world anymore, and that the things that they'd seen had made them want to do everything they could to forget that particular time. Many call it the lost generation because of the fact that they were disillusioned and with civilian life. Many did turn to criminal activity. And similarly, it was an age of young people. It was one who wanted to break off tradition. And certainly the popularity of jazz music, which was really picking up, new technology, there were a lot of new possibilities, and certainly there was this great desire to move away from the parents. And certainly, even though the idea of the teenager didn't really come into the sort of 1960s, the idea of a young person wanting to go out and have fun had started to be birthed. And certainly it was in an age where immediately son would take over from dad's business. Son would take over from dad's business and then spend all of his money. And that was pretty much the way that this new tradition went. And this new technology and basically these new things that people could spend their money on, and these conveniences, all these different things that they could have, the ways they could entertain themselves, had certainly allowed them to go out and be young, like people go out and have fun now. So it had changed almost an entire culture away from this sort of traditional conservative work and live by good, honest, moral values, to this culture where those sorts of things don't matter anymore, particularly if you're looking at it in the context of a lost generation who pretty much, many of them had their beliefs in many things shattered during the war. And certainly this idea that the things that they had seen wouldn't be sanctioned by anyone with any good conscience. So there mustn't be anyone watching over them, and certainly that there's no one who really cares about them, or there was that sensation at least anyway. And so with this age of moving away from things, it was almost a perfect fit for them. And certainly in the case of Gatsby and Carraway, there was this desire to move away, that things in their old small hometown weren't good enough anymore, that they were too comfortable being back at home, and that they wanted to expand and do something new to make the most of their lives that they got back after the war. But in terms of the rest of the culture and the rest of, I guess, the society of the 1920s, there was this break with not only tradition, but this basically desire to, as I said before, not only want to have fun, but also to explore these new possibilities, to explore the idea of what technology and what the future could hold, and actually start to think about it a little bit. And that's basically it. So those are the main themes, and certainly the ways that you would look at Gatsby interpretively. Of course, the main thing for you to do now, and the main thing to look at from here, is to look at, okay, what parts are especially relevant to what you're looking at, and certainly you should be focusing now on looking at parts of the text to identify not only quotes, but also various sections that you find are important. And certainly you can attach these ideas to them, and they're very good ways of being able to talk about the text as a whole, but also be able to talk about certain sections specifically. And certainly when you move on and start critically analysing it, these sorts of ideas will give you a lot of depth and a lot of merit towards any argument you put together. But otherwise, until next time, I'll see you later.